Okay, as I mentioned in the intro, we're going to start looking at this high frequency stuff that occurs all the time in real systems. We want to know when we can ignore it and when we have to include it. We're going to start with when we can ignore it first, because if we can ignore it, if we can't ignore it, then we've got to include it. And so if we can determine when it's relevant, then we can determine whether we've got to include it or not. So the rule of thumb for this is that the system is going to be dominated by the dominant poles, or the slow poles. Okay, we can't move the system any faster than the slowest piece of the system, which is represented by the slow poles, or the poles closest to the origin. And so those are going to be the dominant poles. And if we have poles that are 10 times larger than the dominant poles, we're going to consider those high frequency, and we're going to ignore them. And so here in this graphics I've got up here, it goes through this, and I'm going to go through it relatively quickly. But we've got a nominal plant, and this is typically what we might model in here. We've got our controller, maybe a P proportional controller, a PD, PI controller, whatever. And then we've got our nominal plant. This is the stuff that we see and we model. And then we've got this high frequency stuff in here that we may or may not be aware of, and we may or may not model. And so we need to figure out what the relationship is between the nominal and the high frequency. When does the high frequency stuff need to be included, and when can we ignore it? And so in this case, it's very important that you understand that we're talking about the closed loop poles. The closed loop poles. Okay, we've been dealing with open loop systems in our root locus, but in this case we're talking about the closed loop poles, because the closed loop poles are the ones that show us what the system is going to be doing when we subject it to a step input. And so in this case, we have to know what the gains are, and have to be able to define the location of the closed loop poles. And when we do that, we end up with these two transfer functions representing the nominal system without the high frequency, and then the system with the high frequency in here. And so in doing that, we would end up with a set of poles in here that would be our nominal, okay, and then we would also end up with some poles out here that would be represented, that would represent our high frequency. Hopefully they're out here, and what we're looking for and seeing if we satisfy is this 10 times rule. The frequency of our high frequency needs to be, our high frequency poles needs to be 10 times that of our dominant poles in order to ignore them. Okay. Now this is Dr. Shinstock's rule of thumb in here, and it's a little bit long, but try to hang with it. We can ignore the open loop poles in zeros when they are more than 10 times larger in terms of magnitude than the closed loop poles that result from ignoring them. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at is the closed loop poles and seeing if they're 10 times larger, the high frequency closed loop poles, seeing if they're 10 times larger than the nominal closed loop poles. And if they are, then we can ignore them in the open loop system. Okay. Now, you're like, I'm sure you're thinking, why are we going through all this rigmarole? Because if we start including these things, the models can get really complicated really fast. And so we want to just deal with the necessary elements of the model. So if there's high frequency stuff in there that we don't have to deal with, we know it's not going to be an issue, then we're going to cut it out and not deal with it. And so it it simplifies the system, and it allows us to do better analysis on that. Now, this is another, just a little comment in here. this is another reason why we can't push the systems too hard. Remember, in some of our simple models, like a first order system, we had just a single pole in here that we found that if we started cranking up the gain for that, we could move this pole out as far as we wanted on the real axis just by increasing the gain. Theoretically, we could do that. But in reality, what happens is that we move it out there a ways and it starts interacting with some high frequency stuff that we're not aware of, and we start getting funky results because these high frequency things, anomalies, start moving in and affecting our output. And so there is a limit to how far we can push these real poles, the dominant poles, because if we push them too hard, they're going to start interacting with the high frequency. Now, we can start taking and including these high frequency in our model and designing a controller to compensate for them if we can measure them. Okay, remember, we can't control what we can't measure, and so we have to be able to measure them, and then we can design a controller to control them. Now, if that's necessary, but a lot of times what we can do is take our simple model and we can work with our simple model, push it to where it gives adequate performance without interacting with the high frequency, and call it a day. Say we've met the specs, we're not pushed it too far into the high frequency range, and so we're good. We're going to let it lie at that. Sometimes we cannot push it too far. And so, let's see. Let me switch over to MATLAB in here, and I can show you the same thing in MATLAB. What I've done here is set up a simple system. This is a little bit like the lab you did. I've got a system in here where I've got 3 poles. If you look in here at the transfer function that I've created, I've got 2 complex poles and 1 real pole. And over here in the PZ map, it shows up with the 2 complex poles and then a real pole in here. Now, you can see from the time domain response of this that it's completely dominated by this real pole here at -1. We can look at the time constant of this. It's 1, just what we would expect. These poles in here, the complex poles in here, are not doing anything in this system. Actually, there's a little tweak right in here that is these real or these complex poles. Now, what I can do with this is I can start move my slider up. I'm going to move my real pole up a little bit in magnitude, and so that pushes it out here. I moved it up a little too far. Let me push it back just a little bit. There we go. And I push it, let the system update, and I push it out here. We can still see we're almost primarily dominated by this real pole here on the real axis. The complex poles are starting to play a little part in here. You can see that some distortion of the time domain response due to the complex poles starting to play with the response in here. But it's still primarily dominated by this real pole in here. Now, we push it up here, and we push it up to this point. We definitely are violating that 10 times rule in here, and now we certainly are seeing some response from the complex poles in here. We've got the real pole out here at -15, and then our complex poles in here, and so we're starting to be dominated. Well, it's not dominated, but both of these are playing a major role in this. We've got our second order system overlaying our first order system, and we end up with this interesting time domain response. Now, I can push this pole on out here on the real axis, and what I find is if I didn't know what I was doing in here, I would think that, oh, I should have a time domain response associated with this real pole out here at almost -40 as its omega. And so I would think I would have just a first order system in here, but what I actually end up with is a first order overlaid with a second order, and so I can't ignore these second order anymore. So if I can keep these poles separate, I could just ignore these high frequency poles in here. Okay, so it's a 10 times rule, and remember, it's magnitude. It's not, and so we're looking at this case. We would be looking at from the origin to our real or dominant pole, and then from the origin to our high frequency poles. And so we'd be using Pythagorean theorem to look at the omega of both of these and compare the omegas and see if it fits the 10 times rule. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing with this, and I'll be back and we'll show you a little more tangible and quantifying this a little bit.